bank on rules of origins and more specifically, how can we design rules of origins that are more inclusive and more sustainable, both in, I would say, in regional trade agreements or preferential schemes, but also multilaterally. We know that regional trade agreements, to a large extent, have enabled trade to expand among parties to those agreements. But when you look at it from a rules of origin perspective, one could also argue that to some extent they have created limitations, particularly by obliging firms to source inputs within the RTAs, whereas maybe arguably they could develop more effective value chains if they had opportunities to also source some of this material from other sources outside of regional trade agreements. In the case of developing countries benefiting from trade preference schemes, we also know that complying with the strict rules of origin has been a challenge in the past and often has prevented poorer countries to effectively use and take advantage of enhanced market access opportunities. And by the way, we see that when rules of origins are being made a bit more flexible or less difficult to comply with, we immediately see exports in some sectors at least increasing significantly. So a big question has been in this area, how can we come up and design rules of origins that are more compatible, more harmonized, simplified rules of origins. What has been the experience so far in different regional trade agreements or in preferential schemes, and what might be the prospects for further improvements. For this panel discussion, we're very fortunate to have 6 very good speakers, 3 of which are here, 2 are joining us via video conference, and one, Bernard Hoekman, will be joining us in a few minutes. Given the fact that we have quite a number of speakers, what we're trying to do is to have very short interventions. Let's try to stick to 5 minutes and then to engage in a discussion with the possibility of going back to the speakers after some interaction. I'm not going to introduce the speakers one by one. I think you have their bios on the website. So in the interest of time, I will just go through the list, and we'll start with Stefano, Inama. And Stefano, I think if you could maybe help us, set the stage in terms of looking at what are some of the global trends in preferential rules of origins and implications for developing countries. What do we know about utilization rates in different key sectors? What do we know about some of the challenges that exist there? Are there signs of convergence across different models, and so on and so forth?
Thank you very much. I prepared a presentation. I don't think it fits in the schedule, but I tried to compress it as much as possible.
That's okay.
And it was tough because to put, 1 year and a half of research into 20 slides, it's not that easy, but I tried the maximum. And I hope, that you really like rules of origin so that you can enjoy the journey. Actually, we worked with, I'm from ANCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, working in Geneva, and we joined forces in this research with the European University Institute in Florence. And what we worked on, was to find out a possible way forward to simplify and convergence on rules of origin. And basically, to work out a model, the final product of this research is a modern rules of origin protocol, which can be drawn from the lesson learned on utilization rates on one side and an analytical comparison of rules of origin in some important free trade areas agreement. Now, we have to overcome some stigmas when we are talking about rules of origin, because rules of origin, they are not being easy to negotiate at multilateral level, in the sense that we have a customs valuation agreement in WTO, we have an harmonized system in WCO for custom nomenclature. We have also an agreement on rules of origin in WTO, but the agreement on rules of origin, there is no consensus on the adoption of harmonized set of non-preferential rules of origin. As a result, rules of origin in multilateral trade is a no man's land. Now, there is hope. We think and we hope that there is hope. I mean, for at least making progress towards convergence on rules of origin. The rules of origin are a kind of topic that comes, I mean, to the headlines of the press almost every day. When Mr. Trump got elected, he wanted to reform the rules of origin on NAFTA in the automotive sector. And yesterday, the Mercosur European Union free trade area will be negotiated. Each free trade area has its own set of rules of origin. The more free trade area we have, the more rules of origin we have, and the more is a cost to business, because it is difficult for business to comply with rules of origin. Now, there is also another trend which is coming forward, is the fact that governments are very busy and they spend a lot of resources in negotiating free trade areas, and then they want to know if the business is using these free trade areas. And utilization rates are a methodology which is now increasingly used by government and also by private sector to a certain extent, to see if a free trade area is actually used by business. So we build up, I mean, this research program on basically two streams. One is using utilization rates and link it to the rules of origin to see how rules of origin are interacting with utilization rates. The more rules of origin are stringent, the less are trade creating and the less a free trade area agreement is used. And this, another stream, is to detect if there are convergence in drafting rules of origin among different trade agreements, free trade areas, like the TPP or like the European Union South Korea agreement, and etc., and the harmonized set of non-preferential rules of origin, to see if the world in drafting rules of origin is getting to a convergence. Now, let's look at part one. I mean, how utilization rates can be used and linked to drafting of rules of origin. What are utilization rates? First, in the sense that how do you get the utilization rate? A product may be eligible for tariff preferences, either duty-free or reduced rate of duty, but is only at the time of custom clearance that the custom officer say, yes, you enter duty-free. The difference between the two, between the potential of being eligible and the effective utilization rate at the time of importation, is the utilization rate. It tells you if you are getting through customs successfully for your goods when you are importing the goods. Now, in measuring this aspect of utilization rate, we're also getting a first tangible convergence, at least among international organizations, because utilization rate was used in UNCTAD since 1975 for measuring the effectiveness of trade preferences, and recently also the WTO, in the decision on rules of origin for LDCs, came to agree on the same kind of measurement of utilization rate. Now, why at the time of importation or custom clearance, sometimes you don't get duty-free, you don't get what you expect? There are basically three reasons. One is because you fail to produce a certificate of origin or the necessary paperwork that comes with. If you don't have that evidence, it's like, when you pass customs, you don't have a passport. If you don't have a passport, you don't enter, okay? So to get duty-free treatment, you need to have paperwork done. Certificate of origin, of export declaration, you need to have a piece of paper most of the time. So if you don't have it, you pay the duty. Why? Now, There are three reasons why you don't have a certificate of origin. One is because you don't comply with the rules of origin. So you're not respected the percentage criterion, you're not respected the change of tariff classification or any other substantive rules of origin requirement. Or another is because the preferential margin is too low. In the sense, you don't bother to do through all the paperwork if the benefit is very little. But there is very little evidence about this. Do you know how much is the MFN rate of duty for cars in the United States? 2.5%. 2.5% of preferential margin generated more than 80 pages in NAFTA, and Mr. Trump calling for a negotiation of NAFTA rules of origin. So I don't buy the argument of low preferential margin. Another one is because I do not know. Because maybe as a business, you don't know that there is these trade preferences. I also buy not convinced about this argument, in the sense that I'm convinced about small and medium enterprises, which are located in some developing regions. I can buy the argument, but most of the companies should know or should have known about the existence of trade preferences and how to use it. What we have evidence, about utilization rate, is exactly the contrary, in the sense that when the European Union did a reform of rules of origin for least developed countries back in 2011, there has been a significant market response. The LDC countries have managed, and you can see the graph from 2011 is going up. Utilization rate is going up for textile and garments, especially garments of Chapter 62, because the rules of origin changed. Before, these guys, the LDCs could not use fabric from China for export garments to the European Union. After 2011, one simple stage, you do the cut and making up, and you export the apparel to the European Union, and you get duty-free. That's why you see an increase in utilization rate from 50% to 90% in 1 year. And also it is important to note that it's not only an utilization rate that is going up, but also our exports that are going up, from roughly 3 billion to 8 billion. So it's a significant market response from a change in rules of origin, and it's not only in clothing. We have other evidence that this is also happened in other sectors, like this is one case, which is the bicycle from Cambodia to the European Union, a change of rules of origin, and then, you have the increase of utilization rate from about 10% to about, in 2 years' time, to about more than 80%. So a change of rules of origin generates a change in utilization rate. Now, thanks, to new data that we have been receiving from the European Union Commission and a partnership with the Swedish Board of Trade, we analyzed 17 free trade areas signed by the European Union to see how rules of origin and utilization rates are interacting. In the sense that we're getting a more expanded analysis to see the link between utilization rates and stringency of rules of origin. And we get the first results is that there is a relatively high utilization rate when the European Union is importing for partners, and there are significantly lower utilization rate when the European Union is exporting to partners in free trade areas. So now we need to detect, the reason why, there is this kind of divergence, and we also we need to identify if these kind of trends are due to rules of origin. And therefore we came, to analyzing what are the rules of origin that are creating this kind of pattern. How do we do it? Well, without going, just explaining this slide, we filtered the data because 17 free trade areas is a lot of data, so we had to filter, and we utilize as a filter that you have a relatively low utilization rate, less than 70%, a preferential margin which is higher than 2%, and significant trade. Then we filter it, and we look at the repeated offenders. What does it mean, repeated offender? Products that are consistently showing in free trade areas that they are recording low utilization rates in both directions of trade and across agreements. If you see, if you look at the European Union-Switzerland agreement, for instance, there is one category of products that are parts or cars, but consistently in the two directions of trade, European Union to Switzerland, and Switzerland to the European Union, this consistently, the utilization rate is lower than 70%. You go and examine the same, in Egypt, European Union Free Trade Area agreements, same. EU, Mexico, same. So what is the answer? There is a problem with the rules of origin, on cars and parts of cars in EU FTA agreements. So we can, this is an example, for instance, of how identify at 4-digit level that motor cars and rules of origin in the European Union Free Trade Area agreements, they have a problem. Because not only they have an average utilization rate of 39% in trade with Egypt, but also they are recording a consistently low utilization rate in other free trade areas, like Korea, Mexico, and of course Egypt. And then, comes the conclusion, in the sense, obviously, you link the product with the rules of origin. And obviously, from this analysis, you come to the conclusion that motor cars rules of origin, manufactured in which the value of all originating material does not exceed 40%, these rules of origin should be changed, because most likely is the reason why you have low utilization rates in these free trade area agreements. First part of the journey. And then we go into the second part, which is a comparative analysis of the text of various free trade area agreements to see if there is convergence. To see where, if there is convergence, there is no need to fight. So we need to know if there is divergence, then eventually you need to fight and see, how do you converge on these areas. Now we took basically 5 agreements. We took the results of the harmonization work program in the WTO, because there is no consensus WTO on the adoption of harmonized non-preferential rules of origin, but much of our work has been done. It's sitting there, but there is no willingness to adopt. And this kind of set on non-preferential rules of origin is widely regarded as the most liberal set of rules of origin. Therefore, we took it as a kind of point of comparison. And then we also analyzed the other agreements, the TPP, which is the most recent, even if it doesn't enter into force, does not enter into force, it represents, one of the major efforts by 12 major countries in the most growing area of the planet. And the US-Korea FTA, which is a significant free trade area agreement that the US has negotiated with Korea. And we took on the European side the Canadian-European free trade area agreement, because this is the first agreement where the two models, the North American model and the EU model, they came to a confrontation. And then, obviously, to make a comparison with the US agreement, we took the EU-South Korea agreement. Now, then we created a taxonomy to see if there is, what is the level of convergence and divergence, among all these 5 set of rules of origin. And we developed a taxonomy, methodology to compare the rules of origin. We said there is totally or partial convergence when the rules of origin in all 5 agreements are identical. Then there is partial convergence when they are very similar but not identical. And then we took also other categories where they are divergent. There is divergent rules of origin, and may be divergent in the sense that the level of stringency of rules of origin across the agreement is different, or they are divergent, they are not similar, because they are more liberal than the rules of origin contained in the harmonized set of non-preferential rules of origin. Now, the results are surprisingly positive, I would say, for making hope, for getting to a kind of a convergence on rules of origin. First of all, I mean, we found out that the rules of origin in some cases were totally convergent, and this represents 4.9% of total imports from these countries, the Quad countries being European Union, United States, Japan, and Canada. Then for 28% of the trade on imports, the rules of origin are partially convergent. And then from another 22%, the rules of origin in these five, they are even more liberal than the harmonized set on non-preferential rules of origin. So if you take it together, more than half of imports of Quad countries, we have actually convergence on rules of origin, and or you have rules of origin that are more liberal than the rules of origin contained in the harmonized set of non-preferential rules of origin. This is a significant sign in the sense that there is a sign that not only the major trading powers, they are converging on some part, but they are converging also on creating rules of origin which are more liberal and therefore less trade distorting. This is something that we need to build upon. Now, these are some sectors where, I mean, the Quad countries, they converge. I mean, that some examples are salt, wood, and mineral fuels, petrols. And there are some other sectors where there is wide divergence. And not surprisingly, we have divergence on clothing, you know, on Chapter 62, because US are more stringent than the European Union. And you have divergence on fish and crustaceans, because the European Union is more stringent than the US into this sector. And now we come to the conclusion. What are we going to do with this? I mean, now with all this research, and has been a painful journey through the research, I mean, it concludes. What we will do on the basis of the existing research, we will have a model protocol of product-specific rules of origin. You have, in each free trade area agreement, you have 50, 60 pages of regulation of rules of origin. Now, building on the research, we will build up a kind of model of product-specific rules of origin where we will say, for this sector, for fishery products, these are, or for other products, these are the best rules of origin which are identical in all 5 agreements. And if you draft rules of origin according to these rules, you get more or less 90% utilization rate, because this is a kind of golden standard based on the analysis that we have conducted. And so, obviously, we can do this, we can show what are the best example or gold standard of convergence where we have recorded convergence and high utilization rate. For the other sector where there is divergence, we will see what are the options, in the sense, I mean, how, I mean, a certain constituency is drafting rules of origin, and how another consistency prefers to draft rules of origin into another way with respective utilization rates, so that country can eventually adopt, I mean, the kind of rules of origin which they like the most, or which they think that more appropriate to their trade interests. Utilization rates is, as I said, I mean, is an important measurement, because governments sign free trade area agreement, but governments at a certain point, they want to know if these trade agreements are used. So we will try to help government. We have a database in UNCTAD on utilization rates, but it's limited to unilateral trade preferences. What we are planning to do in 2011 is to enlarge progressively these utilization rates to cover utilization rates in free trade area agreements. Some are available publicly, like in the US free trade area agreements, but they're not easy to download from the sites. So we will facilitate the work of the researchers and academics in presenting the available trade preferences in a manner that can be used by researchers, governments, and also the private sector. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thanks a lot, Stefano. I think this is probably one of the most sophisticated and advanced research in this area. And so thanks for sharing with us some of the findings. We'll move now to our second speakers. Luis Felipe Quintero. Luis Felipe is trade and economic issue counselor at the Colombian embassy in Seoul. Luis Felipe is joining us through video conference. We're very grateful for that. I don't know how late or early it is in Seoul, but in any way, thanks a lot for being with us. Felipe has produced a more detailed PowerPoint, which has been made available particularly online. But I think you can just go through some of the, we will not be able to show the PowerPoint here for technical reasons, but if you can just summarize for us the main elements in your presentation. Felipe, we asked him to focus more specifically on Colombia's experience with rules of origin consolidation and harmonization models in RTAs, in some of the RTAs that Colombia has been involved with, looking at some of the innovations that exist in those FTAs in terms of accumulation, and lessons learned from the different approaches coming from these FTAs. So Felipe, you have the floor.
Thanks, Christophe. Thanks to all of you. Yes, certainly it's too late here in Seoul. To me, it's almost 4 a.m., but it's my pleasure to be here with you and see some familiar faces there. Gail, Stefano, and Anna, I think the conference. It's good to see you guys again. What I would like to know is, what I will do is just to share with you our experience in Colombia, which is living in country on incorporating and making reality some of the accumulations provisions that we included in our free trade agreements. Pointing out which of those have been successful and mentioning which are not. That is basically the main conclusion at the end of this presentation. Colombia has been in a process of negotiation with different countries, but the more important are the United States, of course. We have also an agreement with Canada, an agreement with the European Union, with the European Free Trade Association, and finally I will mention the Pacific Alliance. So, in our agreement with the United States that was negotiated around 2006, we included some provisions that were aimed to obtain raw material from third countries. The first one that I want to highlight is the nylon provision. The nylon provision allows us to bring nylon from Canada, Mexico, and Israel from same countries. The agreement with the United States. That provision was inherited from the Ambient Trade Act and applies since the entry into force of the agreement. Second, thinking also on textiles and apparel, we included real recommendation provision that mentioned that 6 months after the entry into force of our agreement, both countries will revise the domestic legal requirements and to see if some materials will be included in the agreement with the purposes of, bringing some materials from the countries we were thinking at that point, of some man-made yarns from Mexico and also from Israel as well, but different to the nylon. We were thinking of polyester, we were thinking of all of different materials. That provision was included in the agreement, but even though the agreement mentioned that we will work on that 6 months after the entry into force, this provision has not been developed so far. So, the second negotiation I want to mention is the Canada negotiation. We have a bilateral agreement that was negotiated simultaneously in Peru, and we Since the second year of entry into force of this agreement, we are allowed, and Canada is allowed as well, to bring materials from the United States. So every material, raw material, intermediate material, all parts that are important to Canada from the United States or to Canada to Colombia are recognized as originating in the framework of the bilateral agreement. We also included the same provision that was included in our agreement with the United States on Inama, but only from Mexico and from the United States, not from Israel. And we also included another provision with Canada that mentions basically that we are going to study on the future the possibility of including new raw materials from peer countries that were or countries with which we have free trade agreements in common. Later, we included also in our negotiation with the extra countries, Switzerland, Norway, we included provision in which we are also thinking on working on the future on the idea of formulation or one free trade agreement formulation, thinking also on the possibility of bringing some material from a country. That provision is also a theoretical provision. So, we also included some provision with the European Union. Basically, we have the possibility of accumulate wind among the other countries. If I can bring raw material from Peru or from Bolivia and transform it into a final product and send those products to any country of the European Union with preferential treatment. And we also included in the European Agreement the possibility of developing in the future the population with any other Latin American countries, such as, let's say, Mexico or Argentina, Mercosur, or Brazil. But that's also a provision that is not enforced. So, we have some provisions that are enforced and others that are not enforced. More recently, Colombia became part of the Pacific Alliance countries. Pacific Alliance is comprised of Chile, Mexico, and Peru, and Colombia as well. Those four countries negotiated a free trade agreement. Free trade agreement that entered into force on May 2016. What's new about that agreement? The possibility of accumulating among the four countries. So this new agreement, which made in practice was to create a convergence that do not replace the previous agreement that were between the countries, let's say Colombia, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Colombia, Chile, or Chile, Mexico, and so on and so forth. But instead of that, create a new free trade area and the possibility of bringing materials, let's say from Chile, and transform those materials in Colombia and send those materials as final products to Mexico with preferential treatment. So in practice, the Pacific Alliance came a process of convergence itself. Now, in the Pacific Alliance as well, we were aware that some raw materials were not produced on the Pacific Alliance countries, and that's why we also included a unilateral provision which allows us to bring elastomeric materials from the United States. If we need it, we can buy elastomeric can from the United States, transform those materials into final products in the Pacific Alliance, let's say in Colombia, and send those final products to Mexico or Chile with preferential treatment. This particular provision, or an undeniable provision that I mentioned before, all of them in a unilateral basis, meaning that
rules for you.
And allowing the country as part of the agreement to have that raw material from that reform. So, at the end of the day, what we have in Colombia are agreements in which we included provisions unilaterally that are applicable or became applicable since the entry into force of those agreements. To summarize this point, what I said is that we have nylon that we can bring from Mexico, Canada, and Israel, our agreement with the United States. We have the provision with nylon for bringing that material from Mexico, Canada, from and the United States to our agreement with Canada. We have also the possibility of accumulation with the United States in our agreement with Canada. We have the possibility of accumulation with other countries and Central American countries with the European Union. And we have also the elastomeric provision that I mentioned with the Pacific Alliance, and of course the full accumulation among the members countries of the Pacific Alliance. Those provisions have been really successful, are applicable, and enforced since the entry into force of our agreement. However, those agreements, we have, let's say, theoretical provisions that the textiles and apparel agreement that we include in our agreement with the United States that haven't been, that we haven't developed and we haven't put in force. And also we have similar provisions in our agreement with Canada, with the European Union, with EFTA, that haven't been developed so far. And it seems to me that negotiation. So at the end of the day, we're going to add a new spaghetti in the spaghetti bowl of different agreements in the world, because at the end of the day, the four associated countries and the four countries of the Pacific Alliance are going to create a new agreement of 8 countries, let's say like a small community, with a new set of rules of origin, but with the possibility of accumulating among the 8 of them. But again, with a new set of rules of origin are going to be necessary. So it seems at the end of the day that unilateral provisions are the most successful way to create accumulation with third countries. And it seems also that in our experience, a new negotiation in which new countries became part of a new free trade area of trade, free trade area is the best way to create convergence and accumulation if countries are interested in the structure. Thank you so much. I stop like this. I stop this right here, and I am willing and able to answer any questions you have on this topic.
Well, thanks a lot, Luis Felipe, for sharing with us this very concrete experience of Colombia through its different negotiations of different FTAs. Let's move immediately to Anna Jerzewska. Anna is a global trade and customs consultant with the private sector. She's also joining us via video conference. And Anna will really try to give us the private sector perspective, and particularly looking at the challenges faced by the private sector actors in complying with the rules of origin requirements under multiple schemes, and again, what are the opportunities for enhanced accumulation. Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see all the familiar faces as well on the panel, and to everyone else greetings from a very cold and snowy London, when it's currently 7 in the evening. Now, yeah, I'll present a bit more of a different perspective, so a private sector perspective I get from work with clients on rules of origin and trade under different preferential regimes. Whenever However, today I want to start somewhere else. So one of the things I was thinking when preparing for this presentation was thinking what conditions would a policy proposal or a rules of origin reform need to fulfill in order to be sustainable and inclusive? What does it mean from a private sector perspective to be sustainable and inclusive if we're talking about rules of origin? So if we just take a minute to look at these two conditions very quickly, again, just from my private sector experience, when I think about rules of origin being inclusive, I'm thinking about greater flexibility and wider participation, especially for these companies that to date might not have been able to participate in preferential trade. Now, Stefano very kindly explained why companies might not be able to take advantage of preferential rates. To a certain degree, I agree, but to a certain degree I have a slightly different opinion. A lot of my clients are multinational corporations, and they still come to myself, to my company, for advice on how to use rules of origin. Even large players, large multinational global companies, very often struggle with applying rules of origin. It might not be the simple rules of origin, 40% value added, perhaps not the most difficult one, although calculations in certain cases are also tricky. But very often when they have issues with direct shipment or third-party invoicing, these kind of issues can really cause problems. And often the preferential margin offered by trade agreement is just not worth the additional cost of complying with these rules. So my perspective here is slightly different. Again, it's good to point out that 2.5% to 0.73% customs duty is very often a very low cost for a company. It's a multinational company. Compared to import VAT, transfer pricing, other taxes, customs duties usually might not be that high. So companies very often decide to pay customs duties even if they can comply with rules of origin because of the administrative burden and barriers. Another reason why a company might not, large or small company might not use preferential rates, and another reason why the rules of origin might not be inclusive is because they are not designed properly and they are used as a barrier to trade. Now, I came across an example recently with one of my clients where an entire sector was excluded or was not able to use the preferential rate because of the way the rule of origin was written. So it was one of the EU agreements, modern EU agreement. It requires the manufacturer, the company, to produce a product from originating base metal. The problem is that the base metal does not exist in EU or partner country. So as a result, without compromising the quality of the product substantially, a lot of the companies, if not all of the companies, cannot really comply with this rule of origin. So my question here is, do we want to have trade agreements with 95% coverage or 98% coverage, which in reality exclude entire current mines because of how restricted the rules of origin are? Or should we just have trade agreements with lower coverage that have rules of origin that companies can actually meet? Now, the second part, and very quickly, is the sustainability. Now, sustainability, I'm assuming, means different things to different people, and on the panel we probably have different views of what constitutes a sustainable rule of origin. But for me, in order for a rule of origin to be sustainable, it first and foremost has to be practical. So it has to allow the collection of revenue. It must protect or safeguard the domestic market. So at the end of the day, rules of origin are designed to protect or safeguard the domestic market. And if the rule of origin is not able to do that, it probably won't be applied and it's not a sustainable rule of origin. So therefore, to what extent can we allow a greater flexibility, or to what extent we can make rules of origin more flexible while it's still keeping them or making them practical? And if I look from a kind of wider global trade, customs duties perspective, in order to take advantage of any customs duty relief or company usually needs to fulfill a number of requirements. So just to give you one example, something as simple as a customs warehouse or bonded warehouse, which is a procedure that's available in many regions practically throughout the world. It's a procedure that allows a company to suspend customs duties and import VAT in most cases. Again, it's not a relief of customs duties. It just allows you to suspend the customs duties for the time when the goods are in the warehouse. And even for that, companies need to submit so many applications. They need to get an authorization in the EU. There's a whole list of conditions that companies need to fulfill. They have to show they're financially solvent. They have to provide financial guarantees. They have to demonstrate that their IT systems will be able to track the goods throughout the entire procedure. And then they have to operate the warehouse in a certain way and again meet a number of conditions. So what I'm pointing to here is that any relief from customs duties does not come free. There's usually a list of requirements that companies need to comply with, and these requirements often have a very high administrative burden and administrative cost. Therefore, if this is the amount of work that the company needs to, the EU company needs to put in order to just be able to suspend customs duties for a limited amount of time, how much further can we go in removing barriers and requirements for importing goods duty-free? Basically, what I'm trying to say is how much will we be able to remove additional barriers and additional requirements when it comes to rules of origin. So these two perspectives of making the rules more inclusive and flexible, and then the sustainable parts of making it still practical and proposals that will have a chance of actually applying and working in a kind of day-to-day scenario. It's something that, to my mind, can pose in two different directions. These are things that I look at when I think of what could be done or what potential policy could be introduced at some point. But just very quickly, a couple of things that I think would help from a private sector perspective. The first thing is, when rules of origin are negotiated, consultations. Consult with the private sector in any possible number of industries. Check the impact of the rule of origin will have on the industry, on the quality of the product, and on the consumers. If you have a situation where your entire sector is excluded from taking advantage of preferential rules of origin, or preferential rates because of the rules of origin, something either went wrong during the process of negotiating the trade agreement, or the rule of origin is not used for its original purpose, but is used as a barrier to trade, which probably shouldn't be the case. The second thing, and this one to me is one of the most important ones, practical application when it comes to trade agreements, so the practical considerations. Now, I'm not talking here about policy level, I'm not talking here about renegotiating or FTAs or rules of origin. It's just the implementation side of things, the on-the-ground consultation between customs authorities to different countries or a number of different countries. And to me, this is the area where we can get the biggest value added with the least amount of effort. So these agreements are already in place, but it's the complexity levels, the level where companies can meet the rules of origin but do not take advantage because they either don't know how, can't get the documents, there's a lot of confusion. And again, I see so many examples of these situations. So a way for companies to get clarification from local customs authorities, or local customs authorities to collect information about the challenges that companies are having, and to pass them to policymakers for additional clarification, for additional kind of guidance. Something like that, either on a joint committee or any other system, would be incredibly helpful. At least with my clients, that would easily eliminate half of the problems that my clients are facing. With some exceptions, obviously, still needing additional measures, but it would definitely offer big benefits. Another option is thresholds. When I look at other areas of tax, whether it's VAT or anything else, or even customs, there's a lot of examples of using tax policies from a certain threshold. So even in the origin area, in the EU, for example, we can provide origin declarations on an invoice without being an approved exporter if the consignment is below 6,000 euros. So even in that area, or we take example of the EU's GSP, where you have different rules of origin for at least developed countries and developing countries, you can see that sometimes, depending on the size or income level, different rules apply. This could be expanded. We're talking about making rules of origin more inclusive for small and medium-sized enterprises. This could be expanded and used in different ways for such companies. This could be either by having simpler rules, or by having simple authorizations, or carnets that would allow multiple consignments under the same kind of verification process, or just scrap the rules of origin altogether. Now, obviously, some sort of safeguards will still be needed in transshipment. If you have a small company that all of a sudden exports a huge amount of goods to China, that's probably not the aim of the situation. However, if it's a limited amount of exports and a small company, the impact on the economy, the impact on customs authorities, and the level of income is not really significant. So why not use that? Why not kind of expand that? That obviously has some additional level of complexity, I would do, but you know, it's one of those solutions that we see in other areas that I don't think is applied sufficiently or in sufficient amount to rules of origin. And then lastly, the last point is obviously cross-cumulation, or the expanded cumulation we just discussed on one example. Now, to me, cross-cumulation is really, to a certain extent, common sense and the next logical step. I've been looking at cross-cumulation from the perspective of Brexit, obviously one big based in London. And it's one of those things where, with Brexit being such a unique situation where no off-the-shelf solution will suffice, something will need to be put in place to allow the EU and UK economies that are so interlinked, intertwined, and so dependent on each other at this point to function after Brexit. And cross-cumulation seems like a logical step. And it might be one of the ways to use it, but again, with cross-cumulation, which I'm sure we'll discuss further and we'll discuss it during the debate, but I very much see no downside apart from obviously added complexity. And one last point on cross-cumulation, when we talk about potentially applying cross-cumulation in different scenarios, one thing that I think would be helpful is to start thinking ahead. So we see a lot of issues with the current rules of origin and the current system. In order not to have the same issues with rules of origin for cross-cumulation or cross-cumulation in general, we could already start to try to solve some of these practical solutions, such as transport, such as invoicing, such as documentation that needs to be provided, and make sure that while as these policies are implemented slowly, they already address the issue that we're struggling now in terms of the standard origin regime. And I'll stop now. I think that covers at least 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Anna, for your intervention, and particularly for coming up with very specific proposals and policy options in this area. In the meantime, we've been joined by Bernard, who had to go to another meeting. Welcome, Bernard. Why don't you come and join us? I think I'll give you the floor right now, and particularly ask you to look a little bit at the impact of rules of origin in the context or their contribution in shaping international supply chains. Please, I just remind the speakers, in the interest of time, can we try to stick to 5 minutes so that we really have some time for discussion. Bernard,
he doesn't have.
Bernard, no, I think we'll just give you a microphone that we can use for question and answers.
Thank you. Okay, sorry for being late. I am at fault. I told Christophe that I would be here, and I told somebody else I would be somewhere else at the same time. So the person who paid me the most won. So I had to go to the other meeting first. So five points. I think one question I would have when it comes to rules of origin, and I've been doing some work with Stefano on rules of origin, isn't all this completely passé, right? We're in a world where tariffs are very low. We're in a world where everybody has signed preferential trade agreements with each other. So lots of companies have duty-free access to their markets. So is this still kind of a relevant type of issue? And I think what we've seen in the NAFTA renegotiations is that, you know, the answer is this is very much alive and well, right? So this is something that still is a big issue, and it's certainly something that is important for companies. And I think what we have is we have this tension, which is alive and well, and we see it very much in the US context, which was already mentioned by the previous speaker, is on the one hand, you need to have rules of origin to essentially to deal with potential trade deflection. But on the other hand, you have the abuse of rules of origin for protectionist purposes, right? And I think we see this tension playing out very kind of transparently, well, as transparently as it gets. But if you read the papers in terms of what is at issue in these NAFTA talks, it's very much this tension which is at play there. So I think, so one point there is, despite the fact that tariffs are very low, they're still quite relevant from a policy perspective. I think also, and I think here I would maybe disagree a bit with the previous speaker, they're also very relevant, especially insofar as we're dealing with production that involves fragmentation, right? So if you think about global supply chains, you think about global value chains, you have bits and pieces of a product being produced in different markets. Those processed products cross borders more than once. Quite frequently they cross the border many times. So if you have different rules of origin applying to the different stages of those processes, even if the tariffs are very low, it's still going to add up, right? So there is this accumulation effect associated with both tariff escalation, which we still have, but also with respect to how we might define these rules of origin. So I think, therefore, that makes rules of origin still very relevant in a world where tariffs are actually, on average, quite low. And of course, in a number of cases, we still have tariffs that are quite significant. So there, it does matter quite a bit. So that, I think, is my second point. My third point, and I think I struggled a bit with this title of inclusive and sustainable rules of origin, and my immediate cynical reaction was, well, this is the flavor of the week, so everything has to be inclusive and sustainable. But so what does that actually mean, right? So, and I unfortunately missed the conversation, so I can't educate myself on that. But, you know, if you think about what is a rule of origin supposed to do, a rule of origin is if you take away the protectionist intent part of the equation, it's really to ensure that there's enough transformation going on in the last place of production to actually say, okay, this is enough for us to say this product originates in country X, right? So basically it's technical. So if you say, so how does that make it inclusive or sustainable? That means implicitly we're asking ourselves that the rule of origin should start doing other things, right? So we have different objectives underlying, presumably, what those rules of origin should do. Now, if I think about both inclusion and sustainability from the perspective of production, to me that is much more of a story of standards than it is of rules of origin, right? So we're thinking, what I would be thinking about here then is voluntary sustainability standards, for example, where what we're talking about is the production process that is used to actually create a product. Right now, that doesn't really fall under the heading of rules of origin, but that's one way of thinking about how you might actually get inclusive and sustainability in this particular context. But I think I'm probably ignorant on this point, so I stand to be corrected on that. But I think there is a dimension here. If we think about how voluntary sustainability standards work, it really is all about kind of documenting and certifying compliance by a producer that they've actually met those particular standards. Those producers are located in a particular territory, so in a sense there's an analog to what a rule of origin is trying to do, where it's not about substantial transformation, it's really about do you actually conform with some absolute standards with respect to what we would like to see with respect to inclusion or inclusiveness and sustainability. But that was kind of more of a remark and a reaction. Fourth point is with respect to rules of origin and kind of the new digital economy. See, increasingly as we're moving, not just in a world of global value chains, but we're also moving more and more in a world where products are being digitized, where we're talking about production and trade in services, you have to ask yourself, so how does this rule of origin concept actually pertain to trade in services? On the one hand, you could argue, well, there are no rules of origin because it's very difficult to ascertain where a service is actually produced. On the other hand, you can argue, and I think here there's an analog to be made with these voluntary sustainability standards, we actually are going to have de facto rules of origin that are going to affect trade in services because we have regulatory regimes that, again, have to be satisfied by a producer in order to get into a market. So think about data protection, for example, if you're selling services that require financial information or information about consumers. So I think this is really an area of, it's an open question for me with respect to how do we think about rules of origin with respect to trade in services, and that's just something I'm putting out there. And then the fifth point, and I think this will relate also to what Stefano was saying, I think there actually is a big need with respect to, we can include inclusiveness and sustainability in this particular equation, but there's quite a bit of learning to be done with respect to what actually has been happening with respect to rules of origin for goods. And I think this is something that characterizes many of the questions that are on the table today in the WTO context, where there isn't enough of a focus on what are the substantive dimensions of a particular issue area. And I think here there's a real need, and I guess Stefano has already talked about this need to actually look at what is actually happening with respect to rules of origin in different trade agreements, what is happening with respect to not just the preferential rules of origin, which determine whether or not you get a tariff preference, but the non-preferential rules of origin, and to what extent is there convergence or divergence across those two things. So I think there's quite a bit of work to be done there in terms of actually understanding what are the dynamics and trends in those particular areas as they pertain to both rules of origin in and of themselves to prevent trade deflection, and I think also these types of questions about inclusiveness and sustainability. Thanks.
Well, thanks a lot, Bernard. I think that's really adding a lot of important elements, and thanks also for being really short. Let's move to our next speaker, Gail Strickler, who's president of Global Trade at Brookfield Associates. Gail has been involved quite a lot on rules of origin in the textiles and apparel sector in a previous life. You might want to say something about it.
Okay.
So we'll ask her to focus more specifically on that particular sector.
Okay, so yes, I will. In my previous life, don't shoot me, but I was the Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Textiles and Apparel, but during the Obama administration, and had to deal with the TPP negotiations, where, as you can imagine, textiles and apparel were incredibly contentious, given that Vietnam, the United States' second largest trading partner in apparel, was part of this, and we have the insanely protectionist U.S. textile industry demanding the kinds of rules of origin that we'll see them fight over again in NAFTA. But from a sustainability point of view, there's a lot of legitimacy to some of what sometimes sounds absurd in textile rules. And this is something I feel very strongly about. Prior to being at USTR, I actually ran the first sustainability institute for the textile and apparel industry. It was the Institute for Textile and Apparel Sustainability at Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science. And it was in the mid-2000s, and we were kind of ahead of ourselves. So I've been very involved in this aspect of the industry. So to me, rules of origin in textiles and apparel is kind of a conundrum of convoluted protectionist measures and schemes mixed, however, with the opportunity to preserve value and making sure products are truly manufactured and benefiting those countries who are participating and who are meeting the rules that you're requiring. Now, why is it so significant in textiles and apparel? Very simple. Number one, really 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, of course, is it still has the highest duty rates going into 50% of the users of textiles and apparel, and that's the United States and the EU. The United States maintains duties as high as 32% in that category, our second highest category next to sneakers, basically. And in the EU, you still have duty rates up to 20%. The average is about 15% in the US, 12% in the EU. So we're talking about significant amounts of money. We're no longer talking about things where it's 2.5% and it's not worth the paperwork. Here, it's worth the paperwork, and it's worth complying if you can. On the other hand, also, though, you do have crazy protectionist measures in the United States. I mean, one of the things, like for example, we have this ridiculous rule. I did away with it in TPP, which isn't going to matter since we don't have TPP. But anyway, in some of the United States' previous agreements, they insisted that pocketing, believe it or not, the inside of a pair of jeans had to originate in the region, which is environmentally unfriendly because, number one, it's the kind of thing that can often be used from scrap and waste if you don't have to actually document where it came from. And second of all, it was completely ridiculous. And it was, of course, one manufacturer, 2 manufacturers in Georgia and Alabama whose congressman then said they weren't going to sign on to NAFTA or CAFTA if they didn't get what they wanted. So these are the kind of things, these are not sustainable. These are not rules we should be encouraging. On the other hand, however, I'll make the argument both from the textile and apparel world as well as ideas like the EGA and things like that, that this is an area where sustainability is so important that we should have rules of origin that protect it. We'll deal with it a little more, I think, in our next session. But for example, textile waste and the use of water and the abuse of water and the chemicals and energy and things like that, as well as the labor abuses that can take place in the apparel sector, these are areas in which sustainability should be first and foremost. I should have the right, if I'm going to have an agreement or preference program, I should have the right to preserve the idea that those goods were produced without using up all the water, without pouring effluent into rivers and streams, and without dumping my garbage, into a landfill. So there's a balance to be had here in textiles and apparel. There's a balance between saying that some of these rules of origin are protectionist and ridiculous, and that some of them they should be meaningful. So for example, it certainly costs a lot more to produce textiles in a zero discharge effluent system. But I want to buy my product, I want to buy my apparel, somebody who did that. If you're pouring your stuff down the rivers, in the oceans, yeah, it's a lot cheaper to manufacture. So on that level, I do want rules. I do want sustainable rules from that side of it. Exactly how you enforce that, well, we'll talk about that in the next session. But there are ways. And, and if we look at the EGA, which is the Environmental Goods Agreement, do I want to be able to make sure that things that will make for a greener economy will be able to be bought at low duties? Absolutely. I want duties done away with immediately in that. Another area in which you have significant sustainability issues would be things like leather processing, where the difference between the kind of leather processing that's allowed in the US or the EU versus what goes on in India is just night and day. I mean, the conditions there and the amount of poisons that leach their way into water systems and they get poured down rivers is just unconscionable. So sustainability figures into the rules of origin if you can find a way in your FTAs, in your preference programs, to put in those kinds of requirements and the traceability of such. So for example, there are certain processes, like you talk about cupramonium rayon, which can be an absolutely toxic process, yet you look at a company like Lenzing in Austria who is able to produce those products in a closed system with absolutely no negative environmental impact. So do we want people to have the right to know or to be able to specify that those downstream products, that those components were produced in those ways. I certainly want that. So I think that's part of the issue in terms of sustainability that we haven't discussed here. It's not just sustainable that is the agreement sustainable, but it's the methodology. And then if you're going to enforce those methodology requirements, you have to have a way to trace it, track it, and certify it. There's one other side, there's another negative side to some of these really convoluted schemes, which is carbon footprint. Do I really want you to have to ship, yarn literally halfway around the world 3 different times, back and forth, and then fabric somewhere else to comply with the rule of origin, creating an incredibly negative carbon footprint? No, I don't. And so those kind of things. So regional accumulation should be a goal of all of our FTAs and all of our preference programs. So how do you balance that? Well, my absolute passion right now is the idea of accumulation in preference programs and in FTAs. The reason, of course, is obviously I can start to specify the sustainability goals and the sustainability needs to meet these requirements in terms of, water usage and chemicals and carbon footprint and all of these things. And, and you could talk about like sustainable down and polyester recycling and specifying a certain amount of, reused and recycled products within that. That's all a very exciting option. But if we do that, and we want to build on these things, the greatest opportunity is to say, well, if I have an FTA with you and you have an FTA and an FTA with country B and country C, and then B and C have an agreement, and then D comes along, if we all have agreements with each other, if we are willing to take the most sustainable, probably the most recent of those agreements, because that will hopefully have, used some of the things we're learning now about sustainability and about improved rules of origin and reducing carbon footprint and helping to have environmentally promising ways of producing some of these things, then that most recent agreement is the one that's going to meet that to the highest degree. So if country A, B, C, and D are all willing to oblige, let's say that A, B, and D did the most recent agreement. So if country C and all these other countries are willing to meet the requirements, the rules of origin under this most recent agreement, we should immediately allow accumulation. This would allow for an immediate multilateral effect that would be drastic, strong, and forward-leaning. And then what you would do, because then each step, and you don't have to renegotiate every agreement then, because everybody's going to want to be able to accumulate with the most number of countries. For example, if I am a Central American country and right now I'm exporting to the United States under CAFTA, and I also have an agreement with the EU, but, and now the United States and Mexico have an agreement, and CAFTA and Mexico have an agreement. Well, right now, I cannot export, I cannot manufacture something, even with US yarn, with all that protectionist yarn forward. I can't take US yarn into Guatemala and then make a product, make fabric, ship it to Mexico, and bring that garment in from Mexico to the United States, even though they share all these agreements and all have this almost similar rules of origin. Well, by accumulating across these agreements, you would immediately do that. You would dramatically increase the number of countries that could benefit from each other's FTAs, and you would be constantly reaching the highest standard, because I'm going to want to be able to manufacture, especially with some of these larger apparel manufacturers and textile manufacturers, I want to be able to ship my garment and ship my product, and it's true in footwear, and it's true in a lot of other products, jewelry and things like that. I'm going to want to be able to ship it to the most number of countries, especially as retailers move across borders, especially as, like Inditex has literally, 3,800 and whatever stores across God knows how many countries. If I'm going to give them the opportunity to be able to make a product and ship it to as many different places under preferential treatment or free trade agreements, I can really set that bar, that sustainability bar, even higher than I would, because I'm giving them that added benefit. So not only am I saving them duties, but I'm allowing them to be able to make a product that they can ship to the largest number of countries and largest number of consumers without having to do what they have to do now, which is literally, if they're shipping to the EU, they're sourcing in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and 17 countries in Africa. If I'm making for the US and I want to take advantage of duty savings, I've got to make it in either Mexico, Central America, 23 countries in Africa that don't exactly overlap, but I can't source in Bangladesh or Pakistan. So by combining these agreements, by offering accumulation to what I call the highest common denominator, the one with the strongest sustainability and environmental protections, I am raising the bar constantly. I'm moving things forward in a really good way, and I'm having an impact, a tremendous impact on global trade. And I'm having a really good impact on the environment. So I will stop with that because that's my ultimate, and then if there are any questions.
Thanks, Gail, for your passionate plea. Let's move to our last speaker, Mustafizur Rahman, distinguished fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh, who will give us I guess an LDC perspective on particular concerns related to rules of origin.
Thank you, Christophe. Yes, I will try to give an LDC perspective on what we are discussing, and I will make 5 quick points. When I was looking at the theme towards inclusive and sustainable rules of origin, I was recalling that how this was defined in the 1990s, when the European Union for the textiles, the rules of origin for knitwear was 3-stage conversion, and for wovenwear it was 2-stage conversion. And when we found it difficult, it was argued that that if you have very flexible rules of origin, then the benefits go to the countries from which you are importing. Maximum benefit goes there. So if you have 3-stage or 2-stage conversion, then you will have backward linkages developed in your own countries. So that was the argument. And countries like Bangladesh, in fact, gave 25% cash compensation scheme to backward linkage industries in order to develop those and get zero tariff access by being able to comply with those 3-stage and 2-stage conversion. And then when in 2000 the green paper for the EBA, which came into being in 2011, was floated, I remember that the Bangladesh Textiles Mills Association, they went to Brussels and argued that don't change the rules of origin. Let it be 2-stage and 3-stage, because in that case, the ready-made garments exporters would source from Bangladesh and then be eligible for zero tariff. And the apparels exporters, they went and said that no, change the rules of origin, and because 1 stage will be helpful for us. So that the conditionalities, in fact, is also what we'll have to keep in mind. So my point is that make it predictable, because for countries like ours, this shifting of the rules is not very helpful. Now, second point is the Bali LDC ministerial decision on the rules of origin. So there also we see that all the 3 types for the rules of origin, the value addition, although it was mentioned that 75% non-originating, meaning 25% local value addition requirement. So that was good. But then also change in tariff headings, change in tariff subheadings was also kept. And also at the same time, the conversion criteria was also kept. So it remained, sort of a complex, whilst the LDCs were wanting more flexible, rules of origin. So all the 3 types of, rules of origin were kept. So from that perspective, I think the Canadian rules of origin, which is for the LDCs, which is 25% local value addition, flat. So I think that if you look at the Canadian rules of origin and the utilization by the LDCs, you'll see a very significant spike, because it is very simple, it is very flexible, and it is LDC friendly. So I think that type of what we really expected from the Bali decision was that type of flexible rules of origin, which will be very simple, 25% local value addition. So that is the second point. The third point is this compliance requirement and certification. And now, for example, we have, for Bangladesh, we are member of the SAFTA. There is a SAFTA rules of origin. There is SAFTA rules of origin cumulation. Then with some of the SAARC countries, we are going for the bilateral FTAs. There will be also another type of rules of origin. So this, what Bhagavati said, spaghetti rules of origin, this is also very onerous for the LDCs. And so it was mentioned very rightly that if the tariff rate is, I read somewhere that if the tariff rate is less than 3%, exporters don't go for compliance, and they would rather pay the tariff rates even if they are eligible for duty free, because the compliance requirements are onerous. So from that perspective, I think that if you are a repeat exporter, and particularly it is important for the small exporters. If you are repeat exporters, then certification requirements should be made flexible. So that is something which is I think very important. And the other point is that now that the rules of origin are being now discussed, and you have mentioned about sustainability. For example, we don't know after Brexit what will be the terms of market access in the UK. What will be the rules of origin? Will it be like EBA? Will it be like different? So that is also something that I think which is of concern to the LDCs as we go forward. And the last point is that for example, this in case of the change in tariff headings which has been kept, or changing tariff subheadings, many of the LDCs are now going for assembling type of, it's labor intensive, and some of the LDCs are going for this assembling CKD and KD type of manufacturing activities. But then those do not necessarily have the change in tariff headings. It is the same tariff headings, even if you are assembling, it's same tariff headings. So they are also, in some cases, it's not the value addition, but the CTH and CTSH. So that is also becoming difficult. So I would argue that if really, because there is a lot of market access given, but we are seeing that in cases many, particularly in some of the newly emerging manufacturing activities, these complexities of the rules of origin is really putting some burden on the LDC. So I would say that a flat Canadian type 25% local value addition, that simplified flexible rules of origin is what will be very helpful. And also because of the rise of the value chains and also regional value chains, I think simplification will be helpful for the LDCs to go forward. And that the original argument that if you have these type of things, it will lead to local industrialization, etc., I think that has not been proved to be correct. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that perspective. We're getting to the end of our panel. I've been very bad at keeping time, but let's see if we can take just a few questions before we close. And let me open the floor. Is there any question? Yes.
They have another.
It's coming. And I'll take can I just see who wants to make an intervention? I have a second intervention there. So let me take those two.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Renato Jardim. I'm from the Brazilian Textile and Apparel Industry Association. My question is to Gail Strickler. You mentioned very interesting suggestions about sustainability aspects related to rule of origin, and we believe that that's very interesting. It should be used, but we actually don't know any agreement current in place with such a rules. Do you know an agreement? Is the US working towards it? Or could you provide something that more concrete on how to relate sustainability to rule of origin?
Thanks. I think there was a gentleman in the back who wanted to make a ask a question? No. Is there any other request for the floor? Well, then, if that's not the case, let's go back to Gail.
So the only situation right now in which you're really seeing the environmental impact of production really taken into consideration would be the EGA, the Environmental Goods Agreement, where there are a large number of textile products, or at least there were. I'm not, given what's going on in the United States these days, who knows what they're choosing. But the idea there was those things that could be used for environmental impact filtration, water filtration, in terms of different kinds of sustainable energy in those products, that those could be duty-free from any. The idea was, for, as you know, with the EGA, for those to be duty-free from anywhere. Now, in many of our discussions during negotiations, whether it was TPP or TTIP, we did have significant discussions about how to manage this type of situation. And one of the things that we considered was the ability of lowering the duty rates on environmentally friendly, productive products. So for example, when you're talking about cellulosics, to leave a cupramonium rayon at a relatively high man-made fiber duty, but dramatically reducing things like a lyocell or something like that, that would be one way to handle it. But we talked about, we talked about how would you create the opportunity of reducing duties on things that were environmentally friendly, and since that seemed quite difficult and basically impossible to handle, in other words, I don't think that the WCO can figure out whether they still can't even really figure out, unless you use a genetic marker, how to tell whether like a product came from recycled polyester or another source. So as you know, what people basically have to do is they have to provide data, and they have to actually have observation, et cetera, for certification. But I think the idea was that by creating networks of reciprocal FTAs and preference programs, where you had countries that met those requirements, who had clean water and clean air initiatives, et cetera, that you would assure yourselves of the fact that this product, that this input had come from clean, productive capacity by doing so. And thus the idea of accumulating among FTA and preference program partners who have had to meet this criteria is really the way to do so. I think there could be the possibility of having, sustainable methodologies that are traced and tracked, and therefore reducing duties, but I don't see that happening. I think the only way to really do it is to basically create those requirements within FTAs and preference programs, and therefore you are encouraging those products to cross those borders with, in a duty-free nature. So I think that's really the only way to do it.
Well, thanks, Gail. If there's no other requests for the floor, I think in the interest of time, we'll have to close here. I would like to thank very much our speakers. Thank Luis Felipe, Quintero, and Anna Jerzewska for being with us through video conference. And please join me in a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.